Greetings everyone, how are you all? Blooming good I hope, and welcome to the third episode of Drawing History with Joshua Holton. If you haven't watched any of the videos in this series yet, it's basically where I draw historical figures and go through their life stories, often from birth to death. And I highly recommend watching the last two videos in this series about Princess Diana and Queen Alexandra, especially if you like unaccounted for copyright claims and cringy art. Yeah, sorry about that one. Perhaps I should visit Princess Di again someday when I'm more used to YouTube's restrictions, lol. Today, however, we will be covering one of the most notorious and famous women in history. So famous that an entire era was named after her reign, as well as multiple roads and often pubs, especially if you're familiar with the EastEnders, or if you live in Cornwall like I do. If you guessed that this famous woman would be Queen Victoria, then you would be correct. Queen Victoria, although often labelled nowadays as a domestic tyrant and a sign of the rather unpopular history of British imperialism, her reign in no doubt made Britain and its place in the world a rather powerful and influential state. And much of what she did defined much of the foods and trends still used not just in Britain, but also around the world, such as Victoria sponge cake, Christmas trees, wearing white at weddings, and stories of true love. Queen Victoria was born Princess Alexandrina Victoria of Kent. Yes, her birth name wasn't actually Victoria, contrary to common belief, to Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the Duchess of Kent, and Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, on the 24th of May 1819 in Kensington Palace. Victoria was never actually supposed to have been queen, or even born if it weren't for the tragic childbirth death of Princess Charlotte of Wales, who would have become Queen of England if she had lived long enough to secure her place. But tragically, she died, and her baby, who would have been heir to the throne, was born stillborn. This sent England into a succession crisis, and it wasn't long until a whole manner of English princes started marrying themselves off and trying to make possible future heirs to the throne. In 1818, Prince Edward married the German Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and they eventually won this race when in 1819 they welcomed a girl, the hope of the kingdom in crisis. Unfortunately, her father died in 1820 when Victoria was just an infant, leaving her in the often overbearing care of her mother and a new man, John Conroy, who was often rumoured to be the Duchess's lover. Throughout her childhood, Victoria had to live with many unnecessary rules, infamously dubbed the Kensington system. The young princess wasn't allowed to walk downstairs without holding the hand of an adult, lest she fall and hurt herself. She had to share a room with her mother, the Duchess, and both her mother and John Conroy tried multiple times to have her guarantee them some sort of power when the time came for her to become queen, even when she was sick and bedridden. But Victoria was strong-willed and rebuffed their constant requests. She refused to be bullied into doing stuff that she didn't want to do. This had the King, William IV, constantly worried for the future of the already fragile monarchy. He was already quite an old man when he became king, and he knew very well that his time would soon be up. He was no stranger to his fair share of health complications, and was very concerned that he would die before Victoria reached the age of 18. Otherwise, the state would appoint her a regent, her often overbearing mother. This didn't happen, however, but I will discuss that more later. She was also rather isolated from other children and not often allowed outside of the palace, something that I bet probably had a huge impact on her mental health, and she later described her childhood as rather melancholy. Victoria was a very creative child. She adored her dolls and would often make them dresses. Her governess would also help her make paper dolls, and she actually wrote a book about one of these paper dolls, The Adventures of Alice Lascelles, which was recently rewritten by Jacqueline Wilson, a book that I actually have myself, and it is a rather great read. She was educated by private tutors and learnt matters of state as well as languages such as French, German, Italian and Latin, although she only spoke English at home. She also had a beloved Cavalier King Charles Spaniel named Dash, whom she also adored. Dash was also loyal to Victoria, and on one occasion, he even swam after Victoria when she boarded a yacht after he jumped from the coastline. It's safe to say that the pair were inseparable. In the 1830s, Victoria started to travel outside the restraints of Kensington Palace, and this greatly trained her to become queen. Well, as much as her parents wanted it to, as they wanted her as ill-equipped and weak as possible, so that she would forever rely on them both. Another attempted power tactic. She would travel to several parts of England, including Wales in 1832, 33, 34 and 35. She was very popular with the people, who often applauded her presence on each of her royal visits, much to the annoyance of the king, who believed that the Duchess and Conroy was trying to portray her as his rival rather than his heir presumptive. Victoria disliked these trips though, and as she wasn't very well suited for them, she often rendered very tired and ill, and her demanding role left her little time to rest. She was forced to continue these tours, however, her illnesses often being dismissed as childish pretense, and this wore her down until she became bedridden. In 1837, King William IV died when Victoria was 18, and she was informed of this at 6 a.m. In her diary, she wrote of this: "I was awoke at 6 o'clock by Mamma, who told me the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Cunningham were here and wished to see me. I got out of bed and went into my sitting room, only in my dressing gown and alone, and saw them. Lord Cunningham then acquainted me that my poor uncle, the king, was no more, and had expired at 12 minutes past 2 this morning, and consequently that I am queen. Her first act as queen was to ban John Conroy from her presence, and to assign herself her own bedroom away from her mother. She also wished that her regnal name would be Victoria instead of Alexandrina, and she was no longer associated with this name again. She grew a strong friendship with the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne at the time, who often gave the inexperienced monarch guidance and advice from the start of her reign. It's believed that Victoria possibly saw him as the father figure that wasn't ever present in her life. Her coronation took place on the 28th of June, 1838, and it went notoriously wrong. For example, the ring that is famously worn by the monarch during their coronation got stuck to her finger, and it took quite a while for the ring to eventually come off. The elderly Archbishop of Canterbury also nearly tripped and fell, who had Victoria leaping up from her throne and helping him back up again. Due to an insufficient amount of planning, this would become known as the last botched coronation, and the same mistake was more carefully avoided in future coronations. Victoria wrote of the account, "I was awoke at 4 o'clock by the guns in the park, and could not get much sleep afterwards on account of the noise of the people, bands, etc., etc. Got up at 7, feeling strong and well. The park presented a curious spectacle. Crowds of people up Constitution Hill, soldiers, bands, etc. At 10, I got into the state coach with the Duchess of Sutherland and Lord Albemarle, and we began our progress. It was a fine day, and the crowds of people exceeded what I have ever seen, many as there were the day I went to the city. It was nothing to the multitudes, the millions of my loyal subjects, who were assembled in every spot to witness the procession. Their good humour and excessive loyalty was beyond everything, and I really cannot say how proud I feel to be queen of such a nation. I was alarmed at times for fear that the people would be crushed and squeezed on account of the tremendous Russian pressure." Victoria popularised raving to her subjects on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, a royal practice still used by royals around the world today. I bet it would have been great to see the young Queen Victoria and the Victorian royal family on the balcony. She later rushed back to give her dog Dash his bath, which ran on schedule despite the busy day. As young queen, Victoria was unmarried, and this greatly concerned the court, as she was at the rightful age to start making heirs to the throne, and the government tried to match her with a Dutch prince, which went unsuccessfully. She held off marriage and children for a time until she met her cousin, honestly not surprised, Prince Albert of the German Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. She had to propose to him though, as it was considered improper for a foreign prince to ask the monarch's hand in marriage. He accepted, and they married on the 10th of February, 1840. And it was during that time that she popularised wearing white at weddings. As before, ladies often wore their best brightly coloured dresses on their wedding days. The account in Victoria's diary was very telling of the day. "I never spent such an evening. My dearest dear Albert. His excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly hope and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before. He clasped me in his arms, and we both kissed each other again and again. His beauty, his sweetness and gentleness. Really, how can I ever be thankful to have such a husband? To be called by names of tenderness I have never yet used to me before was bliss beyond belief. Oh, this was the happiest day of my life." It was no surprise then that they were going to have their first child 9 months later. So their wedding night doesn't really leave much to the imagination, lol. Albert was often a rather calming influence on his often ill-tempered and moody wife, and he even managed to successfully improve the relations between the Queen and her mother, who both lived in separate far ends of the palace and were rarely on speaking terms. It was during her first pregnancy that she was nearly assassinated by 18-year-old Edward Oxford. This soared the young Queen's popularity, where public sympathy was commonplace. Her first daughter, also called Victoria, was born in the November of that year. Queen Victoria hated pregnancy. She found babies frog-like and ugly in nature, and remarks that she liked what you had to do to make a baby, but loathed the process of pushing one out 9 months later. Likewise. This would soon be improved by the invention of chloroform, which made giving birth much easier. Over the span of 17 years, they would go and have 8 more children together. Albert Edward, who would later be known as King Edward VII, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold and Beatrice. They were mostly looked after by German-born Baroness Lesen, who shared a close relationship with the Queen, but was sent away after becoming the cause of a huge row between the Queen and her husband because Albert deemed her incompetent. She survived yet another assassination attempt in 1842 whilst she was riding a carriage in London, and yet another 2 months later. Poor woman. 7 years later, she yet again survived another attempt, and a year later, she sustained an injury after she was assaulted by an ex-army officer, Robert Plate, after he struck with his cane, crushing her bonnet and thankfully leaving just a bruise and nothing else on her forehead. In 1845, she coined the nickname the Famine Queen due to her delayed response to a sudden potato famine in Ireland. Over 1 million Irish people died of starvation as a result. Although it was rumoured that Victoria only gave £5 to the relief efforts, she actually personally donated £22,000 of her own money. She had a rather rocky relationship with her Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, who often acted on political terms without the Queen's permission. He was, however, ousted in 1851 when the British government's approval of President Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's coup in France without consulting the Prime Minister. He was declared Emperor Napoleon III the following year. Victoria and Albert became icons of domestic bliss, especially after Osborne House was built. It was built as a place for the royal children to better develop their education and life skills. Not only was Albert a calming influence and advisor to his wife and children, but he was also influential in traditional means. He introduced the Christmas tree, a German tradition, to the United Kingdom, which are still used all over the world to this day. He was also heavily involved in the Great Exhibition, a public event held in the Crystal Palace that showcased the latest inventions of the time. However, that didn't stop his wife from being repeatedly pooped on the head by the sparrow that had nested in there, and she notoriously responded to this by ordering that a sparrowhawk be sent in there to take care of the problem. In 1861, her mother died, and after reading through her mother's personal accounts and papers, she discovered that despite everything they had both been through, she really did love her daughter. This left Victoria absolutely devastated, and she resented John Conroy even more for interfering with her mother's relationship with her and heavily severing the ties between both her and her mother. She stated that she blamed both Conroy and Baroness Lesen for wickedly estranging her from her own mother. This plunged the Queen into a depressive state, and she only relied on her husband's influence even more. This wore him down more and more over time, and he eventually contracted typhoid fever after he caught word that his son, Albert Edward, had slept with an actress in university. Albert went to confront him, and they both walked outside in the wet pouring rain that left Albert soaked through. He died on the 14th of December 1861, and Victoria was heartbroken. It was said that after he died, Victoria walked calmly out of the room and screamed at the top of her lungs in grief. She had lost her one and only sweetheart. She blamed her son Albert Edward on his death and stated that he was killed by that dreadful business. She later had her son marry the beautiful Princess Alexandra of Denmark to hopefully stop her son from sleeping around or anything similar happening again. This unfortunately did not work, and he was repeatedly unfaithful to Alexandra. She entered a perpetual state of mourning and wore black for the rest of her life. She became well known for donning black cloaks and cardigans and for wearing her wedding veil. This only plunged her into a further depression, and she dealt with this by comfort eating, which made her gain a considerable amount of weight. I think that if this had happened today, she would probably have been offered bereavement counselling. She was incredibly fearful that she was going mad with grief and would often hold her head in her hands at night whilst failing to sleep successfully. She isolated herself from the public and state occasions that she found quite grueling anyway, and earned herself another nickname, the Widow of Windsor. This slowly infuriated and confused the public over time though, as they started wondering why their tax money that they had worked so hard for was going to a queen that wasn't working for them. This left Parliament quite fearful of eventual backfire though, as the French Revolution was still in living memory after all. This however never happened, as she was slowly coaxed out of mourning by her rumoured lover, hunky Scottish-born John Brown, who started getting her back into riding again. Horse riding, just to clarify. This was shown in a 1997 film starring Dame Judi Dench as Queen Victoria herself. This was around the time that the Queen wrote and published another book named Leaves from the Journal of Our Lives in the Highlands, which featured John Brown frequently and in which the Queen praised him highly. In 1866, she finally attended the state opening of Parliament for the first time since her husband's death. In 1870, Republican settlement in Britain, fed by the Queen's seclusion, was boosted after the establishment of the Third French Republic. A Republican rally in Trafalgar Square demanded Victoria's removal, and radical MPs spoke against her. In August and September 1871, she was seriously ill with an abscess in her arm, which John Lister successfully lanced and treated with his new antiseptic carbolic acid spray. In late November 1871, at the height of the Republican movement, the Prince of Wales contracted typhoid fever, the disease that was believed to have killed his father, and Victoria was fearful her son would die. As the 10th anniversary of her husband's death approached, her son's condition grew no better, and Victoria's distress continued. To general rejoicing, he recovered. Mother and son attended a public parade through London, and after a grand service Thanksgiving in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 27th of February 1872, Republican feeling subsided. On the last day of February 1872, 2 days after the Thanksgiving service, 17-year-old Arthur O'Connor, a great-nephew of Irish MP Fergus O'Connor, waved an unloaded pistol at Victoria's open carriage just after she had arrived at Buckingham Palace. Brown, who was attending the Queen, grabbed him, and O'Connor was later sentenced to 12 months imprisonment and a birching. As a result of the incidents, Victoria's popularity recovered further. In 1876, Victoria was granted the title of Empress of India, after the country was integrated within the British Empire, and she was eventually crowned as such. On the 14th of December 1878, the anniversary of Albert's death, Victoria's second daughter Alice, who had married Louis of Hesse, died of diphtheria in Darmstadt. Victoria noted the coincidence of the dates as almost incredible and most mysterious. In May 1879, she became a great-grandmother on the birth of Princess Theodora of Saxe-Meiningen, and passed her poor old 60th birthday. She felt aged by the loss of my beloved child. It seems to me that no matter how bad she may have been as a mother, she still had some kind of love for her children, even the son she blamed for her husband's death. She did threaten to abdicate 5 times whilst pressuring the Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, to help seize the conflict between Russia and Turkey in the Russo-Turkish War. But her threats went unnoticed as they had no actual impact on the events themselves. In 1883, she was nearly assassinated again, surprise surprise, by a poet who was offended by the Queen when she refused to accept one of his poems, and a schoolboy from Eton College hit the poet with his umbrella until he was ushered off by the police. The Queen was apparently left outraged when she found out that the poet was found not guilty of treason by reason of insanity, but she was later pleased, stating that it is worth being shot at to see how much one is loved. An entire year later, she fell down some stairs at Windsor Castle and became forever plagued by rheumatism for the rest of her life. 10 days later, John Brown died and Victoria was left mourning once again. Victoria and Albert were very strategic and involved in their children's future marriages. Their plan for peace across Europe would be by keeping alliances with European countries, and in their opinions, the best way for them to do that was to marry each of their children off to different European royal families. And today, many surviving European monarchies have monarchs that are related to the British royal family, such as Denmark, Norway and Spain. As she became older, she would accumulate a great amount of grandchildren and great-grandchildren from all over Europe, with her favourite being the future Tsarina of Russia, Alexandra of Hesse, later known as Alexandra Romanov-Fyodorovna, who herself was actually born in Germany. In 1887, the British Empire celebrated her Golden Jubilee, where several kings and princes from around the world were invited to a banquet on the 20th of June. This was also where she met Indian Muslim Abdul Karim, and the two became very close. He taught Victoria Urdu and the Quran as her munshi, meaning teacher. The rest of the British royal family were heavily appalled by this and accused Abdul of spying on the Queen for the Muslim Patriotic League and biasing the Queen against the Hindus. He was subjected to heavy racial discrimination because of this, which often heavily infuriated Victoria. Victoria had made it clear on numerous occasions that she was not a racist and had no time for people that were. Her eldest daughter became Empress Consort of Germany in 1888. But she became widowed a little over 3 months later, and upon the accession of her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, her plans for a peaceful Europe sadly subsided, and years after her death, World War I would commence as a result of her immediate family members feuding. I'm sure this would have devastated Victoria if she had lived to see this. In 1896, she surpassed her grandfather, George III, as the longest reigning monarch in British history. And following her Diamond Jubilee, she was actually spotted on early film reels. And in 2019, on the year of her 200th birthday, and 118 years after her death, a very well-preserved silent clip of her was unearthed in a building in New York. She was reportedly in Dublin and can be seen nodding and waving to crowds whilst receiving flowers and wearing sunglasses. This video apparently dates back to 1900. And although it's never been confirmed, she had her voice recorded in Windsor Castle in the 1880s/90s. It's never been denied either, so... But if you listen to it closely, it does sound like what I think her voice should sound like. In 1900, though, was her annus horribilis, or horrible year, as her grandson, Alfred, died in July of that year. She wrote in her diary, "Oh gods, my poor darling Affy gone too. It is a horrible year, nothing but sadness and horrors of one kind and another." Later that year, she became weak and more ill. She would often have moments of confusion and sickness. By January 1901, she was reportedly drowsy, dazed and confused. She soon retired to her bed, and her entire family was informed. She was actually living with her daughter, Princess Beatrice, at the time, and she knew that the end was near for her mother. Victoria's last request was for her beloved Pomeranian, Turi, be placed on her bed. She died at 6:30 in the evening on the 22nd of January 1901, at the age of 81, apparently from a cerebral hemorrhage, and was one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history, at 63 years and 7 months. She would later be surpassed by Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, at 70 years. In 1897, Victoria had written instructions for her funeral, which was to be military as befitting a soldier's daughter and the head of the army. And white instead of black, as in dress colour, not skin. Trust me, I had to double check that, lol. On the 25th of January, Edward VII and Wilhelm II, together with Prince Arthur, helped lift her body into the coffin. She was dressed in a white dress and her wedding veil. An array of mementos commemorating her extended family, friends and servants were laid in the coffin with her. At her request, by her physician and dressers, one of Albert's dressing gowns was placed by her side, with a plaster cast of his hand, whilst a lock of John Brown's hair, along with a picture of him, was placed in her hand, concealed from the view of the family by a carefully positioned bunch of flowers. Items of jewellery placed on Victoria included the wedding ring of Brown's mother, which Brown gave Victoria in 1883. Her death signalled the end of one of the greatest eras that the world had ever seen, the Victorian era. She was later laid to rest next to her husband. According to one of her biographers, Giles St. Auburn, don't quote me on that, I may have mispronounced the surname, Victoria wrote an average of 2,500 words a day during her adult life. From July 1832 until just before her death, she kept a detailed journal, which eventually encompassed 122 volumes. After Victoria's death, her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, was appointed her literary executor. Beatrice transcribed and edited the diaries covering Victoria's accession onwards, and burnt the originals in the process. To this day, her name and influence is still all over the country, with roads, houses, stations and streets being named after her, and she will forever be remembered. And contrary to historic belief, she had an amazing sense of humour. She would laugh at nearly everything, and, as the not amused rumour was going around for a long time, her granddaughter said in a TV interview in the 1970s that Queen Victoria told her that she had never said that.
wonderful. She was awfully nice. When we lost our teeth, first teeth, she always used to give us £1. And we were terribly pleased. One time, I hadn't seen her for some time, I lost 3, and I brought these 3 to show us. And she said, oh dear, that's very expensive. Yes, she always liked it. And directly after lunch, we lunched very late, 2 o'clock. See, it lasted, we didn't get out till after 3, long after 3. Came back, and then had tea, and she had tea. And she never failed to go out. I mean, sometimes people didn't like going out. I remember Balmoral once, they were sleeping, and she determined to go out. Nobody would go out, so I by great joy and pride, I was about 15, I think, and I took her out. She was very proud of herself. Sleeping, don't go out with her. She never minded. And it kept her so well. We take our grandmothers as a matter of course, don't we? Dear old thing. She nearly died of laughter. We're not amused. And you know, I'm so disappointed. I asked her, and she never said it.
So I think it's safe to say that she herself was a queen who was very much amused. Oh yeah, and her coffin nearly slid off the hearse on the day of her funeral. What do you think of Queen Victoria? And did you enjoy the video? If you did, feel free to send me a like and heck, subscribe if you want to. I most certainly wouldn't object. If you have any questions on who to draw next, let me know in the comments. I love hearing all you guys' feedback. I will see you guys in another video. Thank you and goodbye.